Picture, if you will, a great stone house in the Hampshire countryside, 200 years old and cold in every one of them. It is October of 1850, and inside that house, the most powerful man in the county is dying. His name is Frederick Harrington, the Duke of Renfield. There was a time when cabinet ministers rearranged their days around his moods. Now his hands shake too badly to sign his own letters. The doctors call it a wasting disease of the nerves. A tragedy, they say. Fate. But a young maid named Hannah Price, a woman nobody, in that house has truly looked at in 9 years, has noticed something the doctors have not. The Duke's breath smells faintly of garlic. And no garlic has been cooked in that kitchen. Remember that detail, my friend, because that one small observation is about to save a man's life, or end hers. Wherever you're joining me from tonight, pull up a chair. The fire is lit and the story is ready. If you're new here, welcome. You've arrived at exactly the right moment. And if you've sat with me before then, you know how this works. We take our time. We let the story breathe. Tonight I'm carrying you across the ocean and back 175 years to England, to the autumn of 1850. A tale of poisoned patience and a woman the whole world had quietly decided not to see. Before we step through the gates of Renfield Park, do me one small kindness. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. I read every single one. And if these quiet evenings together mean something to you, that subscribe button is how you keep this fire burning. Now, back to Hampshire, because Hannah Price has just smelled something she was never meant to notice. Renfield Park stood on 3,000 acres of chalk hills and beech woods, a gray stone house with more chimneys than the village below had cottages. It had been built 200 years before in the troubled days of the Civil War, and in all the years since, the servants liked to say, it had never once been warm. Its master had been the same. Frederick Harrington, the 7th Duke of Renfield, had spent 20 years in Parliament making grown men study their shoes. 4 years earlier, in 1846, he had done something his neighbors called unforgivable. He had stood with Sir Robert Peel and voted to repeal the Corn Laws, to strike down the tariffs that kept bread dear and landlords rich. Half the gentry of Hampshire had not dined at his table since. He had never appeared to mind. Cold men rarely do. Then, at the close of June in 1850, Sir Robert Peel was thrown from his horse on Constitution Hill, and 3 days later the great man was dead. Before that July was out, the Duke of Renfield had taken to his bed. Grief said the household. What else could it be? It started small. A tremor at breakfast, a stumble on the stairs, blamed on a worn carpet. But grief does not usually darken a man's skin, or steal the feeling from his feet, or slur the edges of his words. By October, the Duke could not hold a pen. Dr. Ambrose Kettering came every morning to pour his tonic, measuring it out drop by drop with the tender care of a man handling something precious, and every morning he left shaking his head. A wasting disease of the nerves, he told the household. Sorrowful, hopeless, only a matter of time. And through it all, 3 times a day, a maid in a gray dress carried the trays up and carried them down again. It was on one of those gray mornings, leaning across the bed to straighten a pillow, that Hannah Price caught the smell on the sick man's breath. Faint, sweetish, unmistakable. Garlic. In a kitchen that had not cooked garlic in living memory, for the old cook considered it foreign and beneath an English duke. Hannah said nothing. A maid says nothing. That is the first rule of service, and she had kept it faithfully for 9 years. Because here is the truth about a house like Renfield, my friend, a truth this whole story turns upon. Nobody looks twice at a maid. Let me tell you about Hannah Price, because no one else in that house ever bothered to learn. She was 27 years old, plain by her own account, with ink-stained fingers and a face people forgot 5 minutes after seeing it. She had come to Renfield at 18 as a scullery girl, scrubbing copper pots until her knuckles cracked in the winter cold, and she had risen the way servants rise when they have no family name to lean on. Slowly, quietly, usefully. Her mother had been a washerwoman at the county infirmary in Winchester, dead now, taken in the cholera summer of 1849, along with 50,000 other souls across England that no history book would ever name. As a girl, Hannah had spent whole days in those wards folding sheets in the corner, watching. She had seen real doctors stand at real deathbeds. She knew what honest grief did to a man's shoulders. She knew the heaviness of it, the way the eyes would not quite meet yours. And she knew something else. She knew what waited for a maid who lost her place without a letter of character. The workhouse waited. So a maid kept her eyes down and her opinions folded away like linen. The household she served was small and set in its ways. Mrs. Prudence Hartley, the housekeeper, had run Renfield for 20 years by saying as little as possible. Jarvis, the Duke's valet, had developed a conveniently weak stomach the moment his master's illness turned unpleasant and left the sick room work to Hannah. Up in the attic, she shared a narrow room with Sarah, who snored, and Betsy, who talked in her sleep about a sweetheart in the village. And then there were the two men who ruled the sick room. Dr. Ambrose Kettering's silver-haired, warm-eyed beloved. When the cholera came to the valley in '49, he had gone from cottage to cottage without rest, and the village had worshipped him ever since. If an angel had come down to accuse Ambrose Kettering, the parish would have stoned the angel. And Mr. Percival Harrington, the Duke's cousin, his heir. Percival had arrived in the summer and simply stayed, devoted, everyone said, hour after hour at the bedside, wearing sorrow like a well-cut coat. But the servants' hall remembered things the drawing room forgot. They remembered that Percival had sold his matched gray horses last year, then his gold watch. All of it right after the railway king George Hudson himself came crashing down in '49 and took half the invested money of England with him. Servants notice everything, my friend. They are simply never asked. What Hannah noticed that October was the doctor's shoulders. Every morning Kettering left the Duke's chamber with his verdict of sorrow, and every morning his shoulders were loose, light, almost pleased, like a man ticking items off a list that was going exactly to plan. Hannah had watched grief walk out of 100 sick rooms in Winchester. This was not what it looked like. But a feeling is not proof, and a maid's feeling is less than nothing. So Hannah Price, who could not go to a magistrate and could not question a gentleman, did the only thing left to her. She made proof. Each morning it fell to her to wash the little glass from which the Duke drank his tonic. One evening, instead of rinsing the dregs away, she tipped them out onto the windowsill, the same sill where every winter she scattered breadcrumbs for a robin. The next morning the robin lay stiff in the frost, its small claws curled against the cold sky. It might have been chance. Birds die in October. So she did it again deliberately this time. A mouse from the pantry trap, a cracked saucer, a few drops of the doctor's tonic and a little milk. By nightfall, the mouse was dead. That night, while Sarah snored and Betsy murmured to her sweetheart in her sleep, Hannah sat on the edge of her narrow bed with a stoppered vial of dregs wrapped in her handkerchief. The candle guttered, her breath fogged in the attic cold. She understood exactly what she was holding. Not medicine, not proof either, not yet. What she held was the kind of knowledge that gets a duke buried with honors and gets a maid hanged. So let us take stock, my friend, before we go on. A dying duke, a doctor whose shoulders are too light, a cousin drowning in railway debts, and a maid holding a vial that has killed a robin and a mouse. Hannah needed one thing now. She needed to know, not guess. And for that she needed a man of science who owed nothing to anyone at Renfield Park. Her half-day came on Thursday. She walked the 2 miles down to the village to a narrow shop on the high street where the bell above the door gave a dull, familiar clank. Caleb Thorne, chemist and druggist, was a stooped, ink-fingered man who had dispensed remedies to the valley for 30 years and asked very few questions. But he was in his quiet way a modern man. He belonged to the New Pharmaceutical Society down in London, and though no law yet required it, he kept a poison book, a ledger where every buyer of every dangerous powder signed a name. He had reason to. That autumn, the newspapers of England were full of arsenic. The poisoning trials out in Essex, wives in the dock, whole burial clubs under suspicion. The papers had taken to calling arsenic by an old and ugly name, inheritance powder, and honest chemists like Thorne were pressing Parliament week after week to bring in a law and regulate the trade. Hannah set her vial on his counter and asked her question plainly. If a person were given this a little every day for months, what would it do to him? Thorne looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment. Then, without a word, he took the vial into his back room, and Hannah watched a piece of pure science unfold on a scrubbed wooden bench. A flask, a strip of zinc, a measure of acid, a small flame of burning gas held against a piece of white porcelain. And there, blooming slowly across the white like a stain of dark silver, a thin, gleaming metallic mirror. That, said Thorne quietly, is the Marsh test, Miss Price. 10 years ago, that same mirror convicted Madame Lafarge in France of poisoning her husband. He set the porcelain down as if it might bite. There is arsenic in this vial. A person who drinks this every day has no disease of the nerves. That person is being murdered slowly, patiently, and by someone very practiced at it. The cold that settled in Hannah's stomach was not surprise. It was confirmation. Somehow that was worse. There was a remedy, Thorne told her. Hydrated oxide of iron, the iron antidote the chemists called it. Taken faithfully, it binds the poison in the body and carries it out if the damage has not gone too far. He could prepare it. It was not cheap. It was not. Hannah opened her purse and counted out onto the counter nearly 9 years of saving. Every coin she had put aside toward a dream she had never spoken aloud, a little dressmaker's shop of her own someday somewhere. Thorne looked at the money, then he looked at her, really looked the way almost nobody had in 9 years, and swept the coins into a drawer. "Come back Thursday evening," he said. "And Miss Price, hear me once. People who poison for a living do not thank the ones who notice." Friday morning, gray light on the frost. Dr. Kettering kept early hours, his tonic poured and gone before the breakfast trays went up, which meant that for perhaps 20 minutes each morning the Duke of Renfield was alone with whoever brought his tea. Hannah set down the tray. Her heart was beating so hard she was certain it must be audible across the room. She took the twist of paper from her apron pocket, stirred the iron antidote into the cup, and poured the tea over it. When she turned to set the cup beside his hand, the Duke's pale eyes were open. They had been open the whole time, watching her hands. "What?" said the Duke, his voice a slurred rasp. "Are you doing?" She could have lied. A lie would have been safer. Hannah Price set down the teapot and told the truth. "Your Grace, I need you to drink your tea this morning, all of it. It will taste like river mud, and I need you to trust me, though you have no reason on this earth to do so." His brow creased, the first true expression she had seen on that face in months. "Who are you?" "Hannah Price, your Grace. I see to the linens. I have carried your tray these 4 months." "I do not know you." "Know your Grace," she said, and there was no bitterness in it at all. "Most people don't." Then quietly, with this door in the corner of her eye, she told him. There was arsenic in his morning draught. She had proved it, a chemist's test, a dead robin, a dead mouse. And she believed Dr. Kettering knew precisely to the drop what was in that bottle, because he was the one who filled it. The silence stretched. The fire cracked. When the Duke spoke again, the ice in his voice was the old ice, the voice that had once silenced the House of Lords. "If you are wrong about this," he said slowly, "or if you are lying to me, you will leave this house without a character, and you will never work again in England. Do you understand me?" "I understand, your Grace." He looked at the cup for a long moment. Then, with hands that shook so badly she had to fight the urge to steady them, he lifted it and drank. He gagged at once. forced it down, throat-working, eyes watering, and when he set the cup rattling back onto its saucer, he said something she did not expect. Something quiet. "I have tasted metal in that tonic for months, Miss Price." A breath. "But a duke cannot accuse his own physician over a bitter taste. And if I am honest—" His eyes went to the window, to the gray hills beyond. "After July, I was not entirely certain I cared to fight for the answer. Sir Robert Peel was dead. The cause of his life was orphaned. His grief was real, my friend, and that is the coldest part of this whole affair. His grief was real, and somebody had studied it and built a murder inside it. Come back tonight," the Duke said, closing his eyes. "After the house sleeps. I find I have a great deal to understand." And so began the strangest ritual in the long history of Renfield Park. Each dawn before the doctor's footsteps sounded in the corridor, Hannah came to lay the sick-room fire, and in the space of 8 heartbeats, she swapped Kettering's tonic bottle for one of her own. Hers held nothing but honest iron tonic, diluted to the same amber color. Think of that, my friend. Her counterfeit was the only true medicine in that room, and the doctor's true bottle was the counterfeit. After he had gone, she swapped them back so the level in his bottle never changed, and the man who poured from it morning after morning suspected nothing. Each night when the house had gone dark, she climbed the back stairs with a single candle, and they talked. His words came clearer, night by night. On the 6th day, he held a teacup without spilling a drop and stared at his own hand like a stranger's. On the 8th, he asked her name again, properly, so that I do not forget it. On the 10th, the tremor was almost gone. Almost. Because Hannah Price lay awake in the attic that 10th night, doing sums in the dark. His hands were steadier, yes, but his feet were still numb. The gray-brown shadow had not left his skin. And some afternoons, without warning, the fog rolled back over him as if the poison had crept into the room again while no one watched. She counted it through again and again. The tea she brewed it, the tonic she swapped it, the food she carried every plate from the kitchen with her own hands, and tried the leavings secretly on a mouse she now kept hidden in a wooden box beneath her bed. Nothing. The mouse thrived. And still the Duke was not getting well, which could only mean one thing, my friend. There was a hole somewhere in her arithmetic. Something in that house was still poisoning the Duke of Renfield slowly and silently every single day. Something she had not found yet. Now, before we go back to Renfield Park, take a breath with me. If this story has its hold on you the way it has its hold on me, do an old storyteller one small favor. Tap that like button, and if you haven't yet, press subscribe so these quiet evenings by the fire can go on. It costs you nothing. It means everything. All right, the candle's trimmed. Back to Hampshire, because Hannah Price is lying awake in the dark, and her arithmetic will not come right. For 3 nights running, Hannah checked her sums the way a clerk checks a ledger that refuses to balance. The tea she brewed it with her own hands. The food she carried every plate up from the kitchen herself, and tried the leavings on the little brown mouse she kept hidden in a wooden box beneath her attic bed. The mouse grew fat and glossy. The tonic swapped every morning in the space of 8 heartbeats before Dr. Kettering's boots ever sounded on the stair. And still the numbness sat in the Duke's feet. Still the gray shadow lay on his skin. Still some afternoons the fog rolled back over his mind like weather. The answer came as answers so often do on the end of a dustcloth. It was a Tuesday. Hannah was wiping down the sick room, the curtain rails, the high molding above the pictures, when she noticed what the cloth had gathered. Not the honest gray dust of any old house. A fine pale bloom of color soft as flower on the white linen. Green. She stood very still, the cloth in her hand. And then slowly Hannah Price lifted her eyes and truly looked at the walls of that room. Emerald green paper. Ferns and trailing vines, fashionable and bright, hung fresh in the spring. She remembered the hanging of it. She remembered who had suggested it, too, for the suggestion had come from Dr. Kettering himself in the very first weeks after he became physician to the family. A cheerful color, he had said, restful for the eyes. 3 months, my friend, before his patient felt the first tremor. On her half-day, Hannah carried the folded cloth down to the village and laid it open on Caleb Thorne's counter without a word. The old chemist looked at the green bloom. Then he took off his spectacles, and for a moment he looked every one of his years. "Shields green," said Thorne quietly. "Copper and arsenic. It is in half the fashionable wallpapers of England, Miss Price. A German chemist raised the alarm years ago, and the London journals have begun to whisper about it. Invalids who waste away in pretty green rooms. Children who sicken, and no one knows why. When the walls are damp, the paper breathes the poison out as a dust, as a vapor." He set his spectacles back on his nose, and his voice went flat and cold. "You see what this means? The tonic was only half of it. They papered the room itself. That cage was built around your Duke before the first dose was ever poured." Hannah walked the 2 miles home with the wind at her back, and one thought turning over and over like a coin. She could not tear down the walls. She could not breathe one word of wallpaper and poison, not to Mrs. Hartley, not to anyone, without showing her whole hand. But a maid has quieter tools. That very evening, the chimney in the Duke's bedchamber began to smoke. Nobody could say quite why. The damper was found loose. Soot came down. By morning, the room was declared unfit for a man in his Grace's condition. Mrs. Hartley, 20 years of housekeeping wisdom, decided at once that the Duke must be moved to the south chamber. Dry walls, old faded paper the color of weak tea, good morning light. Nobody asked whose word had first reached Mrs. Hartley's ear about that smoking chimney. Nobody ever does. A suggestion from a maid is invisible too when it is planted in exactly the right place. And in the south chamber, away from the green walls, the Duke of Renfield finally truly began to mend. The feeling came back into his feet first cruelly, as feeling does in needles and fire, so that some nights he gripped the counterpane white-knuckled and refused to cry out. The gray shadow began to lift from his skin, and the nights became something neither of them had planned. She would climb the back stairs after the house slept with her one candle and take the wooden chair beside the bed, and they would talk. Hy told her about Cecilia, a young woman from a fine family, dead of the typhoid in 1832, 3 weeks before their wedding day. He told her how a man buries a thing like that and calls the grave a career. 20 years of Parliament, 20 years of being the coldest voice in any room. "I have been watched, Miss Price, every hour of my public life," he said one night, his eyes on the fire. "Sketched in the papers, studied by rivals, performed for by everyone who ever wanted a favor. 30 years of being looked at, and I cannot recall the last time I was seen." He turned his head on the pillow. "You have had the opposite sentence, and it turns out both prisons are built from the same stone." She told him, because he asked, and because no one had ever asked about the dressmaker's shop, the little dream with the bow window saved toward for 9 years, 6 pence by 6 pence. Spent now all of it across a chemist's counter. He was quiet for a moment. Then, in the brisk voice of a man reaching for his pocketbook, he said he would repay it 10-fold, 20-fold. Name the figure. "No, your Grace," said Hannah. The word hung in the air between them. She folded her hands in her lap and found to her own surprise that they were steady. "If I take your money now, I become hired help, and hired help can be replaced, your Grace. I need you to believe that I cannot." The fire cracked, and Hannah watched something remarkable happen in the face of Frederick Harrington, Duke of Renfield, a man who had spent 30 years pricing everything and everyone in England. For the first time in his life, he could not find the price of something, and he knew it. December came in hard with frost on the inside of the attic windows, and with December came trouble because a man was getting well who was supposed to be dying, and the one person certain to notice was the man being paid to kill him. Dr. Kettering arrived for his morning examination, all warmth and silver hair, and Hannah, laying the fire with elaborate slowness, listened to that warmth falter. The pulse fuller, the grip stronger, the speech clear. "Remarkable," said the doctor slowly, and underneath the word, like a stone under snow, there was something else entirely. The Duke, God bless him, played his part like an old actor. He let his words slur. He let his gaze drift to the ceiling. But Kettering was no fool. Before he left that morning, he had prescribed 2 things: a bleeding to be performed within the week and a new tonic. A stronger one, which meant a new bottle, a new color, a new swap on tighter timing under sharper eyes. The terrifying little game Hannah played each dawn had just become more terrifying still. And then that same afternoon came the fragments. She was polishing the brass door plates in the anteroom beside the library, her own name written plainly on Mrs. Hartley's work list, honest as daylight. The library door stood an inch ajar. She was not listening. And then she was. Kettering's voice, low, stripped of all its warmth, cannot wait upon nature any longer. Percival's voice, tight as a fiddle string. The papers lie quiet at Gray's Inn, that end is safe. Then Kettering, again dry as a man reading a bill of goods. My widow in Bath was every bit as stubborn, sir. It ended all the same. Footsteps crossed toward the door. Hannah bent over her brasses rag, squeaking, heart slamming, and the 2 gentlemen passed through the anteroom and by her without so much as a glance as men step past a hat stand. Let us gather the threads, my friend, because Hannah spent that night gathering them too. A will lying quiet at a place called Gray's Inn, where London lawyers keep their chambers. A doctor who could not wait upon nature, and a widow in Bath who had been stubborn, and it had ended all the same. You and I have heard men talk that way about the weather. Hannah had just heard a man talk that way about a human life, and one dreadful question now stood in front of her, demanding an answer. Had Ambrose Kettering done this before? It took 11 days to find out, 11 days of the tightest rope walking of Hannah's life, swapping the stronger tonic each dawn, playing the invisible maid while her mind ran like a mill race. The promised bleeding, at least the Duke escaped on his own, trembling so piteously at the sight of the lancet that Kettering, ever tender before witnesses, put it off to a kinder week. Thorne wrote, first, a plain professional letter to a fellow chemist of the Pharmaceutical Society down in Bath, the sort of letter druggists exchange all the time, asking idly after a physician by the name of Kettering, who had once, he believed, practiced in that city. And Hannah spent her half-day in a reading room in Winchester, a shilling at the door, hunting through the back numbers of the Bath Chronicle with cold fingers and a pounding heart. She found it in the spring of 1846. A wealthy widow, a Mrs. Marchmont of the Royal Crescent, dead after a long decline the physicians called a creeping paralysis of the stomach, the tremors, the wasting, the confusion, month upon month upon month, mourned by all of Bath, and in her will a bequest of £900 to her devoted physician in gratitude for his tireless care. The physician's name was printed plainly, Dr. A. Kettering. A whisker of a name apart the distance a careful man puts between his past and his present. 2 days later, Thorne's colleague in Bath answered and folded. Inside his letter was an old prescription in Dr. Ketteridge's own hand. Thorne laid it on the counter beside one of the tonic labels from Renfield Park, and he and Hannah stood looking down at the 2 slips of paper in silence. The same looped K, the same impatient little flourish at the finish, the same hand. Now understand, my friend, what changed in that moment, because everything did. All this while Hannah had supposed she knew the shape of this crime. A greedy heir drowning in railway debts, hiring a crooked doctor the way a man hires a rat catcher. Percival the spider, Kettering the tool. The truth was colder. Kettering was the spider. He had done this before, patiently, professionally, and walked away with £900 and a new name. It was he who had found Percival, a weak, frightened, debt-ruined man, ripe for the whispering. He had chosen Renfield the way a wolf chooses the herd. And if the scheme ever came to light, who would hang for it? The heir with the motive. While the doctor, as he had once before, would simply evaporate and reappear in some other county, at some other rich man's bedside under some other whisker of a name. They were not fighting one man's greed. They were fighting a man's trade. When Hannah laid it all before the Duke that night, the newspaper, the two slips of handwriting, the widow of the Royal Crescent. He was silent for a long time. And when he finally spoke, it was not fear in his voice. It was the old ice come back from 20 years of Parliament, and something in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Percival believes a sick man is a slow man," said the Duke. "He forgets what year it is. There are copper wires now." Miss Price strung along the railway line all the way to London, and words travel down them faster than any horse that ever lived. "Let us see who is slow." You see, the electric telegraph had come to England, and the wires ran beside the London and South Western Railway straight through the station at Winchester, where a certain village chemist had honest cause to call each week for his supplies. So 2 messages went down those wires, and Thorne's steady hand paid for at the station counter, like any tradesman's business. The first went to Mr. Everett of Lincoln's Inn, the Duke's own solicitor of 30 years, asking one quiet question: had any new will in the name of Frederick Harrington, Duke of Renfield, been drawn or lodged at the chambers of a Mr. Grimshaw of Gray's Inn? The second went to an old acquaintance from the Duke's Home Office days at the detective branch of the Metropolitan Police. 8 men in plain clothes in all of England. The Duke of Renfield knew one of them. The answers came back in 3 days. Not 3 weeks. 3 days. Everett's reply was careful and cold with lawyer's fury. There was indeed a new will, drawn a month past, signed supposedly by the Duke's own hand, witnessed by 2 names no one at Lincoln's Inn had ever heard, leaving everything to Mr. Percival Harrington. Everett had never been consulted. Everett had never been told. And the answer from London was shorter still: evidence first. Bring proof a crime is in motion, documents, money, ink, and paper, and the Home Office could put a detective on a southbound train. Without proof, a Duke's suspicion was only a sick man's fancy. Proof. It always comes down to proof. The forged will, the original with its false signature. The estate ledger with its record of who had been paid and how much and when. Get those, and the whole scheme could be broken open like an egg. And the Duke knew precisely where both were kept, in the estate office at the end of the East Corridor, in the iron safe behind his grandfather's portrait. The estate office that Percival Harrington had quietly made his own private study since the summer. Every road, my friend, every single road led to one locked room in the heart of that house, a room where a maid had no business in a wing, where every footstep echoed. And the only person alive who could walk into that room and out again unseen was a woman in a gray dress with a dust cloth in her hand. In the middle of December, Dr. Ambrose Kettering gathered the household of Renfield Park and delivered his verdict in a voice of velvet sorrow. His Grace, he said, would not see the new year. And Mr. Percival Harrington, grieving cousin, devoted heir, did a curious thing. He announced a dinner. A sportsman's dinner, he called it. The pheasant season was at its height, and it would be only right, he said, to gather the gentlemen of the county, to thank them for their kindness, and to speak delicately of how the estate's affairs might be managed, given his Grace's condition. The invitations went out that week. Mr. Pomfret accepted, so did half the landowners of the valley. And so did Sir Roderick Bell, the local magistrate, a man who had dined at Percival's elbow once a month since summer. Mark that name, because Hannah did. If the law in Hampshire ate its dinners at Percival Harrington's table, then the law in Hampshire could not be trusted with what she knew. The dinner was set for the 27th of December, and at midnight in the south chamber 2 people planned a burglary in the dark. "The safe stands behind my grandfather's portrait," said the Duke quietly. "The combination is a date. The 8th of June, 1809. A pause. The fire shifted. Cecilia's birthday, chosen 20 years ago by a younger and softer man than the one you are looking at. His mouth curved thin and bitter. Percival will not have changed it. Men who rob a house never imagine that its owner knows it better than they do." Then, his hand steadier now than it had been in half a year, closed over hers on the counterpane, and his voice lost every trace of the House of Lords. "Hear me once, Miss Price. If there is any risk, any at all, you drop everything and you walk away. I would rather crawl down those stairs and burn the whole scheme myself than have you pay for my life with yours." Hannah looked down at his hand over hers. Then she went to work. She did not trust to luck. Luck is for people who are allowed mistakes. On the afternoon of the 27th, while the kitchen boiled over into chaos about the pheasants and the fish course, she lifted the estate office key from the housekeeper's keyboard, one key among 40 gone between one bell and the next. Into her apron went a clean dust rag. Onto her arm went the coal scuttle. A maid with a coal scuttle, my friend, can walk through any door in England. 8 o'clock. The dining room blazed with candles. Above stairs, the ring of silver on china, the smell of roast pheasant and claret, the laughter of gentlemen who believed the future of Renfield was being carved and served that very night. Percival sat at the head of the table, flushed, expansive, telling Sir Roderick about a hunter he meant to buy in the spring once matters here were settled. Below stairs, a woman in a gray dress moving along the servants' corridor, her heart keeping time with the great clock in the hall. The estate office was dark but for one low lamp, shelves of ledgers, the smell of ink and cold ash, and on the far wall, slightly askew, the stern, whiskered portrait of the 5th Duke of Renfield watching her with painted eyes. The bottom drawer first. The current ledger, bound in green leather. She turned the pages of neat, old-fashioned columns until she found what did not belong. 2 entries crowded in a newer, hastier hand. To Mr. Grimshaw Gray's Inn consultation upon estate matters, £300. To Dr. A. Kettering, professional services, £150. Then the portrait. It swung on a hidden hinge light as a door in a dream. The iron dial turned under her shaking fingers, the 8th of June, 1809, and the safe opened with a soft, well-oiled click. Inside lay 3 things: a folded document sealed in red wax tied with legal ribbon, the last will and testament of Frederick Harrington, Duke of Renfield, a will his own solicitor had never seen, a packet of letters in a looped, impatient hand she now knew as well as her own, the spider's correspondence, and a single stiff sheet that made her breath stop. A promissory note, Percival Harrington's signature bold as brass, pledging repayment to a money-lending house in London secured, said the careful legal script upon his expectations of the estate of Renfield. Hold those 3 papers in your mind, my friend. A forged will, a poisoned ledger, a note of debt. Before this story is over, they will break one man and condemn another. Hannah slid all 3 inside her bodice, pressed the portrait back against the wall, and heard footsteps in the corridor. Heavy, unhurried, coming straight for the study door, and a man's voice, thick with wine, muttering about a snuff-box. 3 seconds. The window too loud, the desk no cover, nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. So Hannah Price did the only thing that 9 years of service had trained her hour by hour to do perfectly. She became furniture. When the door swung open on Percival Harrington, what he found was a maid at the window with her back half-turned, shoulders, hunched chin, dropped a rag moving in slow, dull circles on the glass. "What the devil are you doing in here?" "Beg pardon, sir." The voice she gave him was flat, apologetic, worn smooth by 1,000 uses. "Mrs. Hartley said the windows wanted doing before the gentlemen sit down to cards, sir." "Shan't be a moment, sir." Percival's eyes swept over her. The gray dress, the cap, the harmless, forgettable shape of her. And Hannah felt his irritation curdle not into suspicion but into contempt. "Well, be quick about it," he snapped. He crossed to the desk, rifled the top drawer, found his snuff-box, and turned for the door without one backward glance. "And shut that door properly when you've done. I cannot abide a draught." "Yes, sir. Sorry, sir." The door closed. Hannah stood frozen 3 full seconds, the wax seal of a forged will printing its shape against her collarbone. He had stood 4 feet from the evidence that could hang him. He had looked straight at the woman carrying it. Because nobody, my friend looks twice at a maid. It was only out in the corridor, walking fast and silent toward the east wing, that the last cold thread of it caught up with her. The window she had been so diligently polishing was furred with frost on the outside. Who cleans a frozen window at 9 o'clock on a December night? One curious glance won, and the question would have asked itself. But men like Percival Harrington do not spend curiosity on servants, and that, in the end, is what it cost him. Everything. Percival noticed nothing. Men like Percival never do. But the next morning the spider felt the web move. Dr. Kettering stepped into the estate office to consult a paper and stopped. The blotting pad on the desk sat a finger's width from its dust shadow. The bottom drawer did not close flush. Small things. Nothing things. Percival would have seen an untidy desk. Kettering saw a visitor. He did not know who. He did not need to. A man who had done this before, patiently in Bath under another name, knew exactly what a trembling web meant. It meant the slow way was finished. It meant nature could no longer be waited upon. Hannah learned of the change the way she learned everything on her knees at a grate. She was sweeping out the little morning room beside the library, and the two rooms in the old way of old houses shared a bricked-up flue. Down the chimney, throat hollow and broken, came half a conversation. A dinner, then. 12th night. That was Percival, eager, frightened. The county reassured. Celebrate the improvement. That was Kettering, smooth as poured oil. And afterward, the strain of the evening, you understand. The heart simply fails. Nothing to find, nothing to test. The voices moved off. The flue went silent, and Hannah knelt in the cold ashes with her brush in her hand, doing the arithmetic no maid should ever have to do. 12th night, the 6th of January, 1851. A party in the Duke's honor, with his executioner pouring the wine. She knew the day. She knew the hour near enough. What she did not know was the shape of it. Laudanum in the port. A pillow in the small hours. A doctor's hands alone with his patient one last time. There is a special kind of fear, my friend, in knowing the date of an attack but not its weapon. That night she laid it all before the Duke, the shifted blotting pad, the voices in the flue. 12th night. And Frederick Harrington was silent for a long moment, firelight moving on a face that had grown this past fortnight, steadily less like a dying man's and more like the portraits in the long gallery. Then he did something she had never seen him do. He smiled. "A party," said the Duke of Renfield softly, "to celebrate my improvement. How very thoughtful of my cousin." He turned his head, and his pale eyes caught the fire. "They have chosen the stage, Miss Price. The audience, the hour. Very well. Then we shall borrow their stage. 9 days. Now, before we walk into that dining room together, take one last breath with me. Remember where we stand, my friend. Hidden in the south chamber lie 3 papers, a forged will, a poisoned ledger, and a note of debt. The executioner has set his date, 12th night, the 6th of January, 1851. And a duke who was supposed to be dying has decided to borrow his enemy's own stage. If you've come this far with me tonight, you're the reason these stories get told. One tap on that like button before the finale, and let's finish this properly. The 9 days before 12th night were the quietest and the busiest of Hannah's life, quiet above stairs, where the Duke of Renfield lay obligingly pale, slurring his words for the doctor, playing the dying man with the discipline of an old parliamentarian who had outsat 1,000 liars. Busy everywhere else. One last message went down the copper wires to London. Mr. Everett of Lincoln's Inn arrived in the village and took a quiet room at the inn, a locked case of papers under his arm, and on to Percival's guest list by way of a roundabout introduction that Percival never thought to question came one more name, a wool merchant from Bradford. A soft-spoken, forgettable man, a Mr. Nathaniel Reeve, and every night in the south chamber the Duke practiced walking. It was not the recovery of a storybook, and I will not pretend it was. Arsenic keeps what it takes for a long, long time. After 2 months of the iron antidote, Frederick Harrington could manage 20 steps, 20 leaning on a cane of black ash, his feet half numb beneath him, sweat standing on his forehead by the 15th step. "I will not stride in there like a play actor," he said on the last night, breathing hard, gripping the mantle. "I will limp in on a stick. And do you know that is better? Let them see precisely what they have done." Then he turned and his voice changed. "When this is over," he said quietly, "I mean for the whole county to know who saved my life." Hannah's heart lurched. "Your Grace, think what people would say about you, about Hannah." It was the first time in 9 years that anyone in that house had said her Christian name as though it mattered. The fire popped. She stopped breathing. "I died once already," said the Duke of Renfield, "in a pretty green room while the whole world watched and saw nothing. I have no room left in my life for the fear of what people say." 12th night, the 6th of January, 1851. The dining room of Renfield Park blazed with candles, and the county had come to feast. They talked of what everyone talked of that winter, the price of wheat since the Corn Laws fell, and whether free trade would ruin them all. Old Mr. Pomfret grumbled about the Pope presuming to carve England into bishoprics as though Queen Victoria did not exist. Somebody mentioned the monstrous glass building rising in Hyde Park, a palace of crystal they were calling it for the great exhibition in the spring. At the head of the table sat Percival Harrington, flushed with claret, describing a hunter he meant to buy once matters were settled. At his right hand sat Sir Roderick Bell the magistrate, and partway down, forgettable as furniture, a wool merchant from Bradford ate his soup in silence. At 9:30, Dr. Kettering touched his napkin to his lips and rose. His Grace's evening draught, he explained with a sad and gentle smile. He would only be a moment. And he went up the great staircase carrying his black bag, and in his breast pocket a small vial with no label at all. The south chamber was empty. The bed was made. The candle was cold. And Dr. Ambrose Kettering stood in the doorway of that silent room and felt for the first time in his long and careful career the floor tilt underneath him. Below in the dining room the double doors swung open. The laughter died by degrees, the nearest guests first, then the rest, each man turning to follow his neighbor's stare until the room stood in perfect silence. In the doorway, thin and pale, his left hand white-knuckled, on a cane of black ash stood the Duke of Renfield. Standing, dressed, alive. His eyes traveled slowly down the length of his own table until they found his cousin's face. "Good evening, Percival," said the Duke. His voice was hoarse, but it carried the way it had once carried across the House of Lords. "I understand this dinner celebrates my improvement. It seemed only courteous to attend." Percival rose halfway from his chair, the color of old candle wax, his napkin sliding to the floor. "Frederick, cousin, your doctor said—" "My doctor," said the Duke, "has said a great many things. Shall we examine a few of them together?" What followed, my friend, was not a quarrel. It was a demolition conducted calmly, layer by layer, by a man who had spent 20 years taking governments apart. First, the ledger laid open on the white cloth between the candlesticks. £300 to a Mr. Grimshaw of Gray's Inn. £150 to Dr. A. Kettering for professional services. Second, the will. And through the doors came Mr. Everett of Lincoln's Inn, 30 years the family's solicitor, who set the forged signature beside a true one and invited any gentleman present to compare the two. Several did. None spoke. Third, the promissory note. Percival's debts pledged against his expectations of Renfield. More than one guest at that table had lost money when the railway king fell, and Hannah watched old hard understanding move down the room like a draught. And fourth, Caleb Thorne, the village chemist, was shown in from the housekeeper's room where he had waited since 7 o'clock carrying a flask, a strip of zinc, a little spirit flame, and a square of white porcelain. There on the dinner table of Renfield Park, among the silver and the hothouse flowers, he performed the marsh test upon the dregs of his Grace's tonic, and the guests of Twelfth Night watched a mirror of dark metal bloom across the porcelain and passed it down the table from hand to trembling hand. "That stain," said Thorne simply, "is arsenic, the same test that convicted Madame Lafarge. There is no argument with it." By now Kettering had to return. There was nowhere else to go, and he stood by the door making his stand, and I will grant the devil this much: he was good. The patient was deluded, he said, enfeebled. A scheming servant girl had poisoned a sick man's mind against his physician, and this was slander against a man of medicine. "Sir Roderick," he said, turning to the magistrate with wounded dignity, "I appeal to you." And Sir Roderick Bell, who had eaten a great many dinners at Percival's elbow, hesitated. Hannah, standing in the shadow of the service door, watched the whole night sway on that hesitation, which is when the wool merchant from Bradford folded his napkin and stood. "Perhaps I can be of service," he said mildly. "Nathaniel Reeve, Inspector Detective Branch, Metropolitan Police, attending at the request of the Home Office." He drew out a folded paper and laid it by his plate. "Doctor, would you have any objection to turning out your pockets?" For one heartbeat, nobody in that room breathed. From the breast pocket of Dr. Ambrose Kettering's coat, Inspector Reeve drew a small vial with no label. He handed it to Thorne. Thorne unstoppered it, passed it beneath his nose once, and looked up. "Laudanum," said the chemist. "Concentrated, enough to stop the hearts of 3 grown men." What happened next happened fast, so listen closely. Kettering moved. One sweep of his arm sent the oil lamp crashing down. The table flame ran along the cloth. Guests lurched up, shouting chairs went over, and through the smoke and scramble. The doctor lunged not for the door, but for the vial in Thorne's hand. For the evidence. Quick, cold, professional to the last. But there was one person in that room who had not looked away. One person whose whole life had been an apprenticeship in watching while others were watched. Hannah Price took the port decanter off the sideboard and brought it down across his wrist. Crystal burst. Wine went everywhere, red as blood across the white cloth, and the vial skittered away over the stone floor. And then Inspector Reeve had the doctor's arms, and 2 footmen remembered their courage, and someone smothered the burning cloth, and it was over. It was over. In the ringing silence, Percival Harrington sank into his chair and put his face in his hands and confessed all of it freely, before any lawyer on earth could reach him. The debts, the whispers, the will, the widow in Bath he had learned of too late and been too frightened to speak of. And out of that broken man came the truest sentence spoken in Renfield Park in 200 years. "He told me all I had to do was not look. And I am best at not looking, Frederick. This whole house, all of us, we are best at not looking." For half a year, 2 clever men had built a perfect murder on one single assumption that nobody looks twice at a maid, and that my friend was the last mistake they ever made. The law, once it woke, was thorough. Inspector Reeve traveled to Bath within the week. Mrs. Marchmont of the Royal Crescent was raised from her grave, and the chemist applied the range test to what remained, and after 4 years in the earth the arsenic was still there. It always is. That is the terrible faithfulness of that poison it stays to testify. At the spring assizes in Winchester, Dr. Ambrose Ketteridge, as Bath had known him, was convicted of the murder of Mrs. Eleanor Marchmont and the attempted murder of the Duke of Renfield. For a proven murderer, the law of England in 1851 had only one sentence, and it was carried out at Winchester that spring. I will say no more of it than that. Percival's case was in its way the sadder one. Conspiracy and fraud, 7 years' transportation. And when the court asked the Duke of Renfield whether he wished to speak to his cousin's sentence, he said only this: "My cousin spent his life believing that being seen matters more than being good. I hope he lives long enough to learn that they are not the same thing. I ask no mercy for him, and no cruelty either. He has already lost everything he believed was worth having. Let the law weigh what remains." A remarkably measured statement the county newspaper observed from a man once famous in Westminster for showing his enemies none whatsoever. That June of 1851. A tall, thin man with a cane of black ash walked back into the House of Lords for the first time in a year and took his seat on the day Parliament passed the Sale of Arsenic Regulation Act. From that year forward, no one in England could buy arsenic without signing a name in a poison register before a witness. And the white powder itself was to be colored mixed with soot or with indigo so that it could never again vanish tasteless and invisible into a cup of tea. The newspapers reporting the new law cited the affair at Renfield among the outrages that had demanded it. And walking out afterward, the Duke said to old Everett half to himself, "It wants one more line, this act of ours. Look at the ones who carry the tea. And now, my friend, the ending you have earned." On a bright morning in the summer of 1851, the bells of the village church rang out across the valley, not for the funeral the county had once expected, but for a wedding. The bride wore ivory silk she had refused every bolt of fashionable green the warehouses offered, and if you have listened this far you know exactly why, and she had insisted the gown be made by the village dressmaker, not sent down from London. The front pews were not filled with gentry, they were filled at the bride's particular request with the servants of Renfield Park, Sarah who wept, Betsy who grinned, Mrs. Hartley, 20 years of housekeeping dignity, undone by a handkerchief. Caleb Thorne stood near the back in his best coat, looking thoroughly bewildered to be included. Even Lady Augusta, the Duke's formidable aunt, arrived with her eyebrows at full disapproval, and left, they say, with her handkerchief wet through. The honeymoon was a railway journey to London, to walk beneath a roof of glass and iron a third of a mile long, the Crystal Palace in the summer of the Great Exhibition, with the wonders of the whole world laid out under one shining sky, and 6 million souls come to see them. And standing in the machinery court amid the engines and the looms, the new Duchess of Renfield said something her husband kept to the end of his days. "Every marvel under this roof," said Hannah, "was made by hands nobody will remember. Somebody ought to remember." She spent the rest of her life making sure somebody did. A school opened in the west wing of Renfield Park, not for the children of the gentry, but for the children of servants and tenant farmers, taught 3 mornings a week by the Duchess herself. The estate ledgers passed into her ink-stained hands, and 2 quiet little frauds that had run for a decade were found and ended within the month. And on the sill of the south chamber window, where a woman still scattered crumbs each winter morning, a new robin came and stayed. There's a simple truth at the heart of this story, and it's one worth carrying with you long after tonight. For half a year, an entire household walked past Hannah Price without truly seeing her, and because of that, they very nearly let a good man die and a perfect crime go quietly by. The murderer in this story did not win his months of freedom with arsenic. He won them with a whole house's habit of not looking. And Hannah did not save the Duke with any miracle. She did the simplest thing in the world, and the rarest she looked. The lesson is not about dukes, or poison, or great cold houses. It is about the person who poured your coffee this morning, the one who holds the door, the one who does the work nobody thanks them for day after day without ever being asked their name. The people most easily overlooked are very often the ones paying the closest attention and kindness, curiosity, and the simple decision to truly look at someone can change the course of a life, sometimes more than one. So tell me before you go, have you ever been a Hannah working unseen, or did a Hannah once see you when no one else did? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one, and stories like yours are the reason this fire stays lit. Until next time, my friend, take care of each other. And look a little closer at the people around you.